For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and socially. In the midst of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other than human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationship to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. This podcast is produced and made possible from supporters on Patreon. Thank you. If the Rewilding podcast inspires you, gives you hope, or makes you think, please subscribe, share it on social media, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. If you're new to rewilding or want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewilding 101 workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. In this episode, I'm talking shop with my friend and colleague, Sharon Kallis. Sharon facilitates a community organization similar to Rewild Portland in Vancouver BC called Earthand Gleaners Society. She's an award-winning artist who focuses on fiber arts through a locavore lens by growing, foraging, and gleaning raw materials and processing them into fiber and weaving them into finished products. She's known for her community art installations, wherein she connects people to their place through creative collective works of art, often with garden waste, invasive species, or other locally available materials. Her book, Common Threads, Weaving Community Through Collaborative Eco Art, was published by New Society Publishers in 2014 and is used in many post-secondary programs as a model for creative engagement in shared green spaces. I met Sharon through our shared passion for using invasive species for art projects. As fellow community organizers within an urban rewilding context, Sharon and I often converse to share ideas, commiserate over similar challenges that we face, and celebrate our successes. In the following conversation, you'll get a bit of all three of those as we discuss the ins and outs and triumphs and failures of running community rewilding organizations in the city. Thank you so much for coming on to the Rewilding podcast.
Thank you for having me here, Peter. I'm thrilled here in my living room, from my studio to your studio.
Yeah, it's funny because you have a blurry background. I think most of the time I can, when your background is not blurred, I can see all of the different craft things that you're working on. It's always nice to sort of, it has that sort of like cabin core vibe or something, but like maybe urban cabin core, craft core or something.
I can unblur my background for you. There you are. You can see the various.
Oh yeah, there's a bookshelf
and the chaos of the chaotic splendor.
So I figured normally when we hang out and chat like this over Zoom, we're crafting. So I figured it'd be, good for me to be crafting on a project. And I haven't really had one the last few times that we've done that. And I do have one now. So I'll share what I'm working on and then you can share what you're working on.
Awesome.
I have been wanting to do the full turn twine fiber baskets forever. And I know how to do twining as a weave, but I haven't done the fiber weaving of it. And I never, even though I understand how the patterning works, I've never done it.
And I don't know what you mean by full turn. So I'm kind of curious about that.
If you can see on the basket, the twining there, it's two different colors, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't look the same on the inside. It's not that I'm swapping colors. It's that the one color that is outside is a color that I choose, and it wraps around the entire piece on the inside of the basket and comes back out. So the same color goes through, wraps around the alternate color and comes back out. So it's a full, because normally in between each warp, you'd have a half twist. So the full turn,
you're doing the full turn.
You're going all the way around and back out.
Nice.
And so that way you can do this sort of two-tone, like a texture that almost looks like pixel art.
Well, and it totally reminds me of Fair Isle knitting, which is, I always find fascinating, all things in the string technologies. It's like I learned how to knit finally as a left-handed person because I had been weaving with Todd DeVries for so long and teaching right-handed weavers how to weave. It kind of rewired my brain. And so I could pick up And it's like that, recognizing if somebody already knows how to weave, they're going to learn how to knit very quickly. If somebody knows how to crochet, they're going to learn how to weave very quickly. Like that brain pattern recognition and training of like top, bottom, left, right, back, front, right? And picking up those rhythms and those cycles is so crossover from one technique and technology to another.
Totally.
Yeah, super cool. That's beautiful.
I've been wanting to do this for a long time. It's just getting all the materials ready, all the stuff. I just kind of was like, you know what, I'm just going to buy a little kit. It comes with all the materials already made.
For you.
It does the thing. I'm like, I'm just going to do it. I'm sort of like, a purist. I hate doing that kind of thing. But it's just like how often, I haven't woven in so long. I need to do it. And I'm just, what are my barriers? So I just bought this little kit and I'm finally doing it. Also, I think I just want to shout out to Brosnan, who put out that full turn twine basket on the trade blanket at Echoes in Time last year. She's a native weaver from Eastern Oregon, Umatilla. And Columbia River is like huge with full turn twine. It's one of the major places in the world where it was like one of these styles. And so anyway, she put out one of her like baskets, and I was just like, oh my God, I want to learn this technique so bad. Cause I think it's just cool. Anyway, what are you working on today?
I am hand stitching. I probably am going to be working on giving myself a hand massage. I've been doing too much the last couple of days. And I was just complaining about some problems in the sort of meat of my thumb. But I've been doing some hand stitching, making myself a pair of pants because I feel the desire for another pair of lighter weight pants made out of an old bed sheet. And I also have been processing nettle. So I spent probably about 4 hours combing nettle yesterday, which I'm going to spin this afternoon. But I need to sort of have fully present brain for that and not be distracted by talking.
Yeah. I think at Echoes in Time this year, I might hang out with you and have you show me how to do drop spindle and spinning of some fiber. Because now that I have a reason to make more fiber, if I get into this particular style, I have bags of unprocessed fireweed bast fiber and unprocessed dogbane and nettle that I gather, and then I'm like, what am I going to do with all this cordage? I don't even do anything with it.
Well, because it's funny. I'm like you. I love processing fiber. Like it's just actually like my it's not a Fitbidget. What is it? Like those things that kids do.
Oh yeah, totally.
Processing fibers is to me like a happy place. It's kind of my self-soothing time. But then what do you do with the fiber? Twining is beautiful with fireweed. I will say just that's I encourage you to try that with your full turn twine.
I will. So you are an artist and a community organizer. I thought it would be cool, and I think there's a lot of parallels between what I do, what you do, Rewild Portland, Earthand Gleaners Society. Absolutely. And so I think it would be cool if you kind of talked about the history of Earthand Gleaners, how it got started, and leading up to sort of what you're doing right now.
Sure. So I am here on the stolen and unceded lands of the Homuquim, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, who have been the tenders of this place since time immemorial. So there are 3 different nations whose land, what we know as Vancouver, Canada, is situated on, and that's 2 languages. And moving here from Ontario, where I grew up, knowing I needed to be by the ocean, it was just such a different place. My sort of desire to get to know the land and the plants as a part of how I could grow roots for myself, because I knew I wanted to be here, but it just the terrain was so different, and so that was 30 years ago, and so the kind of ongoing journey began of figuring out what it meant to grow roots and to recognize where I was growing roots. And what do I want to say there? I started working with green waste piles in probably about 98 or 99, just out of art school by a year or 2.
What do you mean by green waste piles?
Green waste. So like going to the local park and seeing where there was a pile that the groundskeeper from park board would do, like the trimmings pile, with the notion that once a week a truck came by and picked up that pile. It was kind of, drive around pickup. And so I just kind of had this attitude of enough of anything can be made into something, and figuring out what that something was became the joy and the discovery more than actually the making of any particular object itself. So it was like, how bendy are these sticks? And can I peel bark off of these sticks? And, is there color in those sticks? And that kind of inquiry. And that really was my seasonal grounding of becoming aware that there was a seasonal cycle to the groundwork that was happening. And, as a very urban person, like I am right what's known as the downtown east side. I'm super urban. And I was doing that work in part because I had no money, and I didn't want to be a commercial artist. Wasn't interested in jumping into a kind of like make and sale routine. And so also it didn't make sense then to be spending money on buying my art materials if I'm not going to be selling them at the end of that process. So I was just kind of looking at like what were the so-called free materials that I could access in my environment that were low barrier. And that just opened up so many windows and so many opportunities that started to reveal themselves as I started to discover that world. And that led me to working with invasive plants and with ecological organizations that did invasive removal, and looking at those plants as like, well, why are these plants classed as invasive? Like how, especially if they were brought here for a reason, what was that reason? And is that, it's like, how are humans just removed from the system? And now that's a part of why we have invasives, because we are no longer kind of in relationship with these plants. And so what does it look like to start to kind of explore that? So I had been weaving, but without any actual training. I'd been just kind of, I had early day, I went to a technical vocational school called HB Beal that I did textile design and very like hand technology arts. Well, this is back to me saying that I didn't sleep well last night, so I'm struggling with language. Yeah, so like vocational arts. So there wasn't a strong conceptual, but a really strong craft grounding in my high school years. And so I had some like cloth weaving on a loom experience to understand tension and over under and that kind of basic, but I hadn't ever done any basketry. So I was kind of making my way along on weaving these large forms with involving community to sort of work with me and things we were finding in green waste piles and coming out of invasive plants, and wanted to actually develop some real skill, shall we say, and met Todd DeVries, who is a cedar weaver who is Haida. He was separated from his community as a child through the 60s scoop, which is something you can just put as your, Canadian history notes, if that's not something you're familiar with stateside. So he was relearning his own culture and cultural traditions through cedar weaving, and was having that ongoing issue of like, how do you access cedar in the city? What does it look like to be teaching with cedar or to be accessing cedar? And you can't. And I was tapped into working with all of these invasive species. It was like, there is an abundance of material. What does it look like to be using these materials to teach these traditional skills? And a big thing for me is cedar is not a part of my cultural identity. There is no cultural history for me with cedar. I have respect for cedar, and I have respect for cedar weavers, and I am very cognizant of the fact it is not my material or my cultural piece to step into, and the importance of saving cedar or spruce roots and other materials that are in finite amounts for those that need that material for their cultural work. So that doesn't mean I can't use all the same techniques with materials that are still connected to this place, but that have an abundance, and therefore are fantastic materials to have that learning journey with. And my thing that I teach to people, even if cedar is in your cultural lineage, if you're just new to weaving, don't start with cedar. Like, make yourself worthy before you meet cedar, right? Learn on other materials and get some of that learning, some of your mistakes out of the way, so that when you are stepping into a relationship with those plants, you're worthy of those plants, is kind of the way I think of it. So anyway, I did this project with Todd, and we just learned so much together, and it really was kind of a fantastic project. And that was me spending a lot of time writing grants and connecting with the nonprofits that supported us in kind of being the lead organizations for those grants. But I was doing the administrative work and kind of the managing of the project, if you will. And so over time, it was like I kept Jill Weaving, who has since retired, but was with the Vancouver Park Board here and had been a champion of my work in working with community and working with green waste and invasive species. And she was always saying to me, Sharon, you're just going to need to start a nonprofit, because the city does not go into partnership with individuals. And that always felt really intimidating and overwhelming until at a certain point it didn't. So that was when I eventually founded Earthand Gleaners, which was an organization that just grew out of my own inquiry-based community projects. And so our basic mandate is, or guiding principle is, how do we be makers without first being consumers? And that question just poses the start of the journey to discovery. A part of that has been working out of 2 city parks that are environmental learning gardens. So Means of Production Garden is a place that has really profoundly impacted my both creative practice as well as, I think, my own kind of human learning journey or story in terms of how I've grown from my involvement with that place. It's a garden that was started by Oliver Kellhammer in 2002. If you haven't already, future interviewee would be Oliver. Yeah, he's pretty fantastic as a permaculturalist and writer, planting forests for 100 years from now up in northern part of the coast, and just really thinking progressively about how is land used, who's accessing land, what are the plants, what are the plantings. And the Means of Production Garden was a call out that the Vancouver Park Board did, looking for an environmental art project in around 2002. And so his application was for turning this hillside into, that was just a very steep, hard to mow, hard to tend, underloved piece of land, somewhat abused piece of land, blackberries and Scotch broom, and people would throw mattresses and filing cabinets, just like a dump, like an urban dump site for things that should not have been going into the blackberry pile. Anyway, he worked with Environmental Youth Alliance to design and plant up the garden to grow artist materials, with the notion of creating a space for artists that wanted to find out if they were, for instance, dyeing a shirt, how many plants and how much land might it require to have the dye required for that shirt versus going to the shop and buying the dye. What was it like to build that relationship back to material? hence the name Means of Production. And I got involved there in 2007 as a volunteer. And I had at that point several years, 7, 8 years of gleaning and foraging from green waste piles, not foraging in the sense of picking, but definitely foraging in a gleaning sense. And the notion of stewarding and stepping into relationship with place and plants was profoundly changing, just even in terms of thinking about the seasonality of, I'm maybe planting this year, knowing I'm going to be harvesting it next year. So I already had seasonality pretty dialed in just from the labor timeline of how seasonal work happens in city parks, but this shifted that dramatically. And also just the tending of a green space that is itself a living sculpture, so that there is, the plants are growing and we're using the plants and we're harvesting the plants, and we have this working landscape, which is its very own unique aesthetic, very different from what a normal city park might look like, but it also is visually a place of splendor and awe.
When they planned this out, did they have was it, this is just like a 5-year project, or is this a 10-year project, or was it like, this is something that is going to exist in this park forever indefinitely, and here's our plan to get a new person in here to manage it?
It's a little fly by the seat of our pants in some sense of so Oliver as an artist had the intention that other artists would step in and reinterpret and shift and change, and and that there would become this layering of call and response, if you will, of how artists were shifting, the plantings, both based on what's used and what's not used, what's needed, what's, suddenly if there was a paper maker, for instance, to come in next year, we would probably start to see a whole lot more plantings that are veering towards paper making. That kind of, so that was kind of his notion of let's set it up and see what happens, is very much Oliver's way of being. But in order for the project to fly and for Park Board to go for it as a bid, if you will, was the notion that he was working with Environmental Youth Alliance, which is a long-established nonprofit organization that connects youth to nature here in the park. And so within his bid was this maintenance plan that management and using the garden as a learning garden or teaching garden for the management. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then there would be space for artists. And so shortly after the garden was planted, Oliver's life shifted and he ended up moving to New York. So he's kind of bi-coastal. He's between New York City and Cortez Island up the coast here, northern on the coast. And so when I found out about the garden from, again, my mentor, Jill Weaving, who had been a part of the kind of original project happening, Jill saw my work and what I was doing with Park Board Green Waste and said, do you know about the Means of Production Garden? You need to check this place out. And so I started volunteering with EYA, and I knew nothing about gardening. I knew a lot about, what sticks bend and what sticks don't, but the pulling dandelions and planting straight rows of petunias of my childhood had not endeared me to gardening. And it was, a delightful change to have my eyes opened that gardening was a whole lot different than that. And, what it felt like to just step into a role of stewarding and collaborating with plants on the land and having that relationship take root. And so a couple of years after being at Means of Production, I had this opportunity come up to be on a community advisory committee for the park that was being planned at Trillium, and which is about a 15-minute bike ride from Means of Production. The two are quite close to each other. And the park board knew that they had this 1 hectare of land. They'd put artificial, AstroTurf soccer fields on the other 2 hectares. And they knew for this remaining hectare that they needed to have artist involvement. They needed to have something creative. It's right on the edge of a neighborhood that has one of the highest artists living communities and studio communities, and then it's sports fields. So they needed to have something that was kind of like balancing out that space a bit. But they were still like, they didn't know what that meant. They were thinking like concrete pads for changing artists' installations or sculptures, plank art, whatever. And I was able to bring 2 other individuals, Haruko Okano and Penny Copeland, onto that advisory with me. And we were just like, they had no idea what they were getting as 3 pushy women. We were able to basically sort of sell the notion of means of production 2.0. So like issues at means of production that make it challenging for community activation. It's a very steep hill. So site access for many is challenging. We have been terracing it over the years, and so it's getting better and better, but you still have to be fairly agile. It's not ever going to be someplace that would be wheelchair accessible, for instance. We did not have washrooms in the park for decades. Like I think just 2 years ago. Bathrooms, yeah. Sorry, wow. Washrooms, yeah, bathrooms. So just 2 years ago, they opened bathrooms. Is that the American? Is that
yeah, it's just kind of blowing my mind. So, you don't have a place to go to the bathroom in a public park.
That's weird. I know. No, not every park does here. So anyway, they finally did put in a washroom, but it's on the other side of the park. So it's still like a 10-minute walk kind of crossover. So, you come for a 3-hour or a 2-hour event and you're going to leave for 25 minutes to go to the washroom. So we don't have electricity on site. We don't have, we've got a garden shed that's just like a 10 by 8, or 10 by 10 garden shed. So we don't have a lot of space for storage for materials beyond, wheelbarrows and shovels and tools, etc. So with Trillium, I had a couple of years under my belt of working at means of production on the Trillium advisory. I was able to say, here are the things we need for this to be successful, for us to be able to actually use this space. And we had going for us the fact that the soccer fields were already built, and with that was washroom and shower facilities that are super close to where our facilities would be. And being able to say, like, we need some kind of storage, we need some kind of workspace. And it was a small budget park from, what we were constantly being told. There wasn't the money in the budget for a building per se, but we did sell them on shipping containers. And it was the first time Park Board had ever actually designed a park to have shipping containers from the start, instead of shipping containers being this afterthought that get dropped in after to sort of, put a Band-Aid on some kind of community challenge of whatever. So, there's concrete pads that have 2 shipping containers. They have baseboard heating, electric light, and all kinds of outlets for being able to run dye pots off of. We've got fenced work bays off of each shipping container. So, we've got a designated space that's, 20 by 20 with picnic tables. That is our designated outdoor classroom or studio space. And, running water, we can plug in kettles and put on the dye pots when we need to heat up larger pots of water, whatever. But we've got some of those key things that were not possible at means of production. We've created a kind of overhead wire system so that we can throw up some tarps and create rain cover for ourselves when we've got sketchy weather that we're outside for. So we've been able to solve a lot of those problems that would stop us from being able to host workshops and facilitate outdoor gatherings.
So what's the like seasonal round of skills and who comes to them? You know, like
So,
what's going on at like the means of production right now? And then
so at the main, so it's interesting. Like we have a weekly stewardship that happens. Like Tuesday nights we're at Trillium, Wednesday nights we're at means of production. That's essentially just like me saying, I am going to be in the garden from 6 until 9. Come join me if you can. And we've got a Slack channels that we use for all of our kind of like cohort conversational chatting. It's funny because in the winter we get far higher turnout for our stewardship than we do in the summer. And I know it's because several of the people that like to garden with us actually work in landscaping or work in gardening. And so the last thing they're going to do after a day of working outside on a midweek day is turn around and come back out to another garden. And right, it's just not going to happen. So in the wintertime, when we're bringing in the willow, for instance, we get lots of people that are coming in at that point, and are really excited to be out in the garden and are kind of, lusting for that time on the land. But it's a very different person often that's interested in the crafting versus interested in the stewarding. There's like a much smaller percentage of people that are really interested in from the plants to the production, if you will. So what's happening in the gardens right now? We've been planting out the indigo and the coreopsis and the scabiosa and some hollyhock, various dye plants that I've started from seed in my apartment. And they've been hardening off on my balcony. And so I'm sort of biking as much as I can with like 12 plants at a time up hanging off of my handlebars to get the plants up into the gardens, and weaving fences and wood chipping pathways, and doing some defining of edges. I'm a very tough love plant mom in a way, in that things have got to be pretty drought tolerant and pretty hardy to survive, because I don't have the capacity, I don't have the time to be too too tender or too particular with things. So things either make it or they don't. And we have a very, like, there's lots, everything is, what some would call weedy, shall we say. But I have learned the joy and brilliance of a well-woven fence. That I think is like my big takeaway, is if you weave a nice fence edge in an area and put some wood chips down for the pathway, community members know where they're being asked to walk and where they're being asked to stay away from or stay out of, and hope the dogs may jump over, but it's pretty clear your dogs are not supposed to be in the lupin bed, for instance. So it also gives the look of something is going on here and somebody is paying attention. So even if to somebody's mind all those dandelions should have been pulled, and we've left them because they're bee fodder and are actually going to be coming along and gathering the stems in the tall grasses because they're beautiful to weave with. Others might see them as being messy, but they don't make complaint calls to the city. That's always my kind of like, am I getting complaint calls to the city? Right. And if I'm not, I'm doing okay. So a well-woven fence does a lot for just.
At what point in this like journey of building all of these different things did you write your book Common Threads? Which is about community building, community through collective art projects.
So Common Threads came out the same year, actually, that I started Earthand Gleaners and that Trillium Park opened. And I remember thinking, it's like I've had 3 children this year. Like, it was just insane. Like the opening of a park and the birthing of a book and the birthing of a nonprofit. It all felt a little overwhelming. And the timing was all really, really tight in there. And so when Trillium opened, the timing was kind of remarkable in that now we've designed this place, and now of course they need an organization to step in and run it, and Earthand Gleaners had come into being. So it was just basically like, okay, can you make this work then? Now that you've, made us do all these things, are you going to make it work?
Yeah.
And I was like, yes, I can make it work. So the unspoken thing here that does need to be outlined is that none of this pays well. Most of what I do, let's just be really clear about
I don't think anybody expects any nonprofit to pay well.
No. And, I think people often look at our website or see the wide variety of things that we do and assume that there is operating funds, operating grants, whatever, that is like, the secret sauce that's making it all. And the secret sauce, honestly, is that I am in social housing. I'm in an artist co-op that allows me to live a life that is economically from, a different decade.
Totally.
I don't have children. I don't have dependents. I was able to go through school without having a debt load, and I don't, I'm not a consumer. I don't spend a lot, and also I'm not saving a lot, but so I live pretty close to the bone, and that allows me to spend my time on projects that I'm passionate about, that I'm excited to invest my time in, that I feel I can give back to my community. And I am not having to chase a paycheck on the same frenetic level that the majority of Vancouverites are, because the city is, I think like any city, it's super expensive and it's getting worse and it eats people up. So, I am able to do all of this work because of that baseline of having social housing that is providing for me, and it means that I can turn around and provide for my community.
Yeah. I think it's similar with me and Rewild Portland too. And it's interesting, like, I would, did I do this wrong? No, I'm fine. Sorry, I'm looking at the weaving pattern. It's a similar thing, right? Where like for me, I don't have kids, I have zero debt. I never went to college, so I have no college debt. I just did everything from, on my own, but not really on my own, because it's a community process. Like, and we get funds from lots of donors and stuff like that, but it's not a thing where any of us are like making money. And a lot of our, we have like a greenhouse space, that's 100 feet by 30 feet. That space is donated to us by private property owners, under the idea that at some point, if it becomes profitable, we pay them a stipend or whatever, but as a nonprofit, we can kind of do some of these things or have these benefits. But like, the only way this exists is essentially is if people decide to live in poverty or not poverty, but, like being broke or something.
Well, and it's that, it's rewilding, Peter. It's stepping outside of the existing system, and it's having the capacity and having the privilege to step outside of the existing system, right? Like that's a big piece. And then how do we use, that gift that we have to be able to support others in slowly making those steps to, I love the term back sourcing, and that we have outsourced taking care of ourselves for many generations now, step by step in, small incremental ways. We have outsourced the everything. And I think that has left us with this hole of need or desire or emptiness that is that unnameable that we, and when I say we, I mean societally at large, are striving to fill and are striving to to fix, or just that need for consumption is driven by trying to sate a need, which is there because we have forgotten how to take care of ourselves. And as we start, and this is so coming from my own lived experience of how my desires have changed and lessened as I have learned how to make things for myself. And the more I am making for myself, the more I am taking care of myself, the less need I have to sate some unnameable desire that would be propelling me to go to the mall and shop for quick fix, or, you know, go and just, you know, have like those consumptive extreme behaviors that perpetuate and drive the consumer industrial system.
Yeah.
So, you know, backsourcing, how do we come back to growing our own food, making our own food, building our own homes, tending our own homes, and making our own clothing, growing our own clothing? What, you know, food, clothing, shelter. How do we learn to care for ourselves and our neighbors and our communities and be able to fulfill our needs and our desires in that good way?
So is there I don't know much about like the commons, but when I think about things like the projects that you're doing that are essentially like public spaces for public use, it's still managed in a way, right? Like it's not like anybody can just come in and cut anything, right? Like you're kind of the one essentially that dictates what is harvested and when and all of that stuff to make sure that it maintains itself.
And you know, so that it's an interesting and bizarre thing to find oneself as a, you know, white settler descent woman with the privilege that I've grown up with, being in a place that is unceded territory, tending and taking care of stolen land, as someone who would never be able to afford to own land. It's bizarre. There's a lot there that is strange and absurd that I am completely aware of. And one of the things that gardening and plants, I think, have taught me is the notion of the long game and seeing things on a longer timeline than perhaps just the here and now, or even my lifespan, or even working lifespan. And that, you know, the traditions of this place were that you inherited a place, and that was, you know, like inherited is kind of a weird translation or a weird way to put it, but that there was the sort of like, this was so-and-so's fishing spot, and that this was like the family place. But it didn't mean that you were the only one that was putting fishnets in. What it meant was that you were witness to this place, and that you passed that down to your children in the same way that the stories of that place had been passed down to you. And so that was your role, was to be witness and holder of the knowledge of, is this a good year for the salmon? Is this not a good year for the salmon? So if others were wanting to put a net in the water, then they would come to you, and you would be able to say, oh, actually, we've already had X number of families here, or this isn't a great year. Or so there was just somebody who was paying attention and who was holding those stories and had that awareness. And that is kind of where I feel my role is in these two places that would have been a traditional marsh. So means of production is on the south side, and Trillium is on the north side of a place known as Squy Chase, which was a intertidal zone that was a rich fishing, hunting, shared territory by the three nations. And it was filled in with all of the land that was moved in bringing the trains through to the you know, the roundhouse where the trains turned to head back east. And so there's this huge cut that was put, and they dumped everything in this intertidal zone. It would just be another asshole move of let's just like stop any autonomy that these people might have on tending for themselves. And yeah, this looks like a great place to fill a hole. Anyway, so
it's so weird because I remember you explaining this to me on site there and just being like, wait, this was an intertidal zone?
Yeah,
how?
I
it's
know.
Been totally terraformed. It's bizarre.
Yeah. And now they're building the new St. Paul's Hospital is going in right beside us at Trillium.
That's right. Yeah, you told me that. Yeah,
we're gonna have, and they're like on the third floor right now. So we're gonna have this like, I don't know, 19-story hospital right beside us, which is, really, this is going to be okay for earthquakes. Anyway, Megan Inez
climate change.
And climate change, yeah. But, it was Megan Inez from the Squamish Nation put it so aptly when she just made the comment that they stopped the tide. They moved the tide. They stopped the tide.
Yeah.
And so I am, when I do a land acknowledgement at the start of workshops, both for means of production and Trillium, I really try and share as best I can that notion of place of where we're working and what would have been here, and how in the plants that we are planting and in the plants that we are tending, we are given this opportunity to step back into relationship with the living system. And we will never be able to recreate what was, but how do we consider the plants that would have been in this place that may still fit in, or how do we still support feeding community through the food forest that's at MOP, or in clothing ourselves and making stabs for ourselves, and just ways of stepping into some self-care and community care in relationship with place and in our time in the gardens. So I think a big part of my role in being the steward in the here and now is to be able to do some of the frontline work that needs to happen in shifting the thinking around what plants deserve to be in public parks and what public parks can look like. So, we have stinging nettle growing, we have goldenrod, we have fireweed, we now have methosh or dogbane, and none of these are plants that are typically seen in a city park. If they're seen, they're often kind of targeted for removal because they're seen, like fireweed in particular is just an interesting one. I've never had any
for removal.
It's targeted for removal. Yeah. Weird. So fireweed, and it's funny. I actually had somebody that had just graduated from some ecology program out to one of my workshops, and she made some comment about fireweed being invasive. And I was like, no. Okay, we need like, I don't know what teacher. But right. Let's just acknowledge that a plant can be invasive and native at the same time, because all invasive means is that some human has decided that this plant does not fit the human agenda for this place.
Sure.
And
or
so
weed even too.
Yeah. Like so, this notion of fireweed, because it does, it's very, the seeds are very prolific. It will grow up in areas, and it tends to be one of those plants that comes up in places that nobody's paying attention. And so it gets, again, like dandelions, it gets this kind of bad rap that people see fireweed growing in a garden bed and they think nobody is taking care of that area because
interesting,
right? Like tisk, tisk, tisk. There's fireweed growing. There's fireweed and dandelions growing in that garden bed. So just the amount of work that I've done in slowly over time working with operations to become accustomed to us growing the plants that we grow for the reasons we're growing them, and what we're doing with the plants that we're growing, and what we're teaching, and how, what that looks like. And I am just really conscious of where, people that I work with, like Cease Weiss from the Squamish Nation, for Cease who does incredible work and is known as the plant diva, but for her to spend her time with like city operations people, having to get into conversation and explain why fireweed makes sense in the park or why stinging nettle makes sense in the park, is just kind of re-traumatizing and re-triggering when this is her territory. Like this is her, this is like her ancestral place, and she is having to have this conversation with a bunch of old white men about what plants do or don't, you know, like it's just it's insulting. It's triggering, it's traumatizing. And so just for that not to be work that has to go to people who are Indigenous skill holders, and for me as somebody who can step into that place and do some of that work to shift what plants we're seeing and why we're seeing them and how we're tending those lands and why we're leaving this longer, because if we leave it longer, it's doing this for the pollinators, but then it also is slipping back into being tended in a time frame that fits in with the fiber harvesting and has all these, you know, that there is that cycle that humans are fitting back into the relationship. So I can do some of that work and start those systems in place, and then also be helping in supporting different skill holders with fireweed for their own practice or stinging nettle for their own practice, and have that material exchange be a part of how people can show up, and whether it's sharing of skills or sharing of materials or both, whatever is a part of how I can be a good, you know, uninvited guest, essentially.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think about language a lot around all of this stuff, and how like what you're describing is sort of this bridging and transformation process of creating. So yeah, I mean, this is I'm going off on a tangent here. I wasn't thinking about talking about this, but I just think about like this linguistic dichotomy that's sort of been levied in the last few years of like settler versus indigenous person or something, right? And so it sort of solidifies by creating a language that has no other thing. It permanizes, like it solidifies these identities rather than makes them more fluid, which is what they were in a more stateless societies, were much more fluid in their identities or their cultural belongings, right? And so part of like our challenge is in this era of these types of frameworks or these linguistic sticky situations of like labeling somebody as a settler or indigenous or whatever. How do we go forward? Like how do we create something new together, right? And not, especially when the state doesn't want that, right? And so to me, it's like a thing of, it's just a sticky situation. On some level, I embrace the language. On another level, the language to me is paralyzing, and also like doing the state's service for them by keeping these different identities rather than allowing people to like come together to build an anti-state coalition.
And, you know,
right?
And I think it's in part, it's the human desire to simplify things that we just kind of, you know, it's like there's an easiness if we just like kind of create this dual, it's like this or that. There's no, and it's like the reality is with anything, it's massively complex. There's huge complexity in any of this. And so we kind of just all agree to on some level use these overly simplified dualist languages to get a point across. But the reality is, yes, it's far more complex. And my thinking has changed so much over the last couple of decades. It's kind of remarkable. And I often wonder, like, is that just age? Is that just because I'm getting old? You know, is that in part like being early to mid 50s versus my, how I saw the world and how I thought and how I needed things to be much faster and much more instant gratification in my 20s. Whereas now I I think, it doesn't seem unusual now that like I have a tree that I've been tending that was planted, an Osage orange tree that somebody gave me as a seedling in exchange for some wood for making a bow, and some hazel, harvesting from our hazel area. And so we tended that tree for a while on the balcony, and now it's planted at means of production. And I kind of take great joy in watching that little osage grow up. But it's maybe 2 feet now, and I think it's like 6 years or 7 years old. And it's like, that's going to be a tree in 30 or 40 years. Will I be around to see it? I don't know. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. But that notion of planting for the future, or having that longer durational thinking, is something that I think is again in the complexity of like settler thinking, of short term, quick fix, quick turnaround, which fits much more the industrialized system and the sort of efficiency model, versus a longer durational thoughtfulness to
it's interesting.
Being in a place.
It makes me think of like the desire, I think, too, for people that are settler descendants to have this linguistic acknowledgement or connection of belonging to place. Like I remember years ago, this is probably like over 20 years ago, I was talking to a friend and he was like I want to be native, right? Like, and he wasn't meaning like Native American. He wasn't saying like genetically or whatever, right? But he was saying he wanted to have that identity, right? That like that thought of connection to place. And I think it's just like a funny. I was like, dude, you're never gonna be, you're never gonna be that. Just don't like. But we don't have a word to describe, like and I think we were talking about this before Robin Wall Kimmerer penned it, but this idea of naturalized non-invasive species, right? Like what's the analogous to culture? What is the because you could say like I'm an ally, but that's still like within the state structure of like fighting the state in a particular way of without being like, no, we're actually both trying to dismantle these structures and move beyond something else, or build something that will last when those collapse or whatever, right? Like, and we're trying to do it collectively and collaboratively. And there's just no word for that, because the majority of things are really about this sort of like, even though that's exactly the work that we're doing, and we're just kind of like, I guess we'll just like use some of this language for now or whatever,
Yeah. And, I think it's that notion of, again, in the context of decolonizing and recognizing there is no such thing as perfect. And so I am not going to get bogged down in trying to achieve perfect. I'm not going to get bogged down in the language having to be right. I think at the end of the day, what matters more are the actions coming from a good intention, and am I doing more good than I am harm in the actions and the work that I'm doing. But I spend a lot of time in like talking to people about stinging nettle in city parks, for instance, and like what that looks like. I've got some really strong feelings about what foraging in the city is like, and the challenges around foraging. And that to me is like really kind of classic settler behavior and attitude of thinking you can just move through a place and help yourself to plants without having any relationship to those plants, without having any relationship to that place, or knowledge of, did somebody else plant these? Is somebody else tending these? What are the other animals and beyond humans that are, and the BS of like, we'll only take 10%. It's like, and how do you know how many other people have been here before you?
Exactly.
Do you have an ingrained memory to know what this place looked like a month ago, to be able to say how many, like, is your 10% actually 80% of the plant for what you're adding, so
it's the same linguistically too, I think, or in the language community here in Portland. I've been a part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde language community for years, and people know that I speak Chinagwawa, and they'll be like, "Hey, can you give me like translate this sentence for me so I can put it on like a slogan to go to a protest or something, you know?" And it's that same sort of mentality, right? Of like not of wanting to take a thing and then use it as like some form of identity, or even though the intent is good, but the relationship doesn't exist with the thing. And to me, shallow. The language, languages to me are alive. So when somebody's like, how can I do this thing? It's like same kind of thing. Can I pick this plant without having a relationship to it? It's the same with the language. Can I pick out this thing without having a relationship to this living language,
and so that's what I'm always telling people, are like, nettles. I always make a point of saying to people, like, when you pinch nettle in the springtime, you are making that plant no longer an A grade possibility for fiber, because you've bifurcated it. It's lost its leader. The plant is going to be split. So for instance, please don't forage for tea and food from my fiber beds that we've got planted here, because and sure enough, this year somebody has come along and topped most of the plants in one of our primary nettle beds for our textile programs. And I was like, why are these plants so short? What is going on? Like, something is wrong with these plants. And I've realized somebody has been picking them. Somebody's been, pinching them off. And so none of them are going to be seed bearing, and they're all not, anyway. That's an ongoing challenge. But the other point is that I say to people, like, find a place that you can plant a nettle patch and recognize you are stepping into relationship with the plant. It is now your responsibility to maintain a relationship with where that plant is. What does it need from you to be strong, and to make sure that it's not being sort of like hacked back by community, or that it's not pissing off the neighbors and kind of growing into the pathways. Like, there are certain things that I do to sort of pull back any rootlings that are, straggling out into the footpaths. And so, how are you then tending and being in relationship with the plant? So if you want to work with nettle, fantastic. Then you're making a commitment. You are finding a place and you are stepping into a long-term relationship. And if you are moving, then you're thinking about who are you passing on that relationship to, right? What does that? And so recognizing it's not a quick, like, I want to work with nettle, I want to do that, and it's like, great, good for you. So are you ready? Are you committing? Are you right? Like, where's the wedding ring? I want to see the proposal. I want to know that you're committed to this plant.
I really wish there was some. It's a shame. I think in a lot of traditional societies, there's ways of marking, in traditional societies as well as state societies, there's like ways of marking fluency and relation, right? Like there's like clan memberships, there's or like a certification, right? Like a thing. And we don't really have that in this wider like rewilding community, or this ancestral skills community, where like, how do you delineate between a noob or some who's like foraging nettles, who doesn't know these things,
right?
Or somebody who's not part of the community at all, who's just foraging just because they think it's cool or whatever, versus like people who've been in it for a long time, who are, who have been through this sort of thing. Like there isn't a and standardization to me is a practice of the state, but there is not necessarily standardization, but like denoting fluency within a cultural context. How do we create a system? Maybe we don't have to, but but it would be great to be able to understand, for people to see the continuity of building fluency and what it really means. And
And so there's so many things there, Peter. I don't know what I want to say first. One is, I find it fascinating. And I think this is like a Canadian American thing, where you refer to the state, and like, this is, you're interviewing your socialist friend here from cute little Canada to the north. I'm being sarcastic there on purpose, but I really am aware of where having, the state, if you will, or a social system that is supporting individuals in a positive way to build the systems for themselves is a good thing, right? Like that there is like a baseline that to my mind can and should come from the state. When I think about how you are using the term the state, I think of it as like the industrial complex or the corporation. I'm in my mind, I just wanted to identify that. In my mind, cool. When you're saying the state, I am interpreting that as kind of the corporation, as like the big C, kind of controller or kind of, lobbyists for, petrochemical state, if you will, to kind of maintain status quo. Anyway, I just had to get that off my chest. So what else did I want to say in response to that? I was thinking about, I remember reading I mentioned Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I was thinking about braiding sweetgrass. I remember being so in awe and despair at the same time in reading about the practice of with sweetgrass and where it was harvested, that this particular community she was working in, they would, if you had come in and done some harvesting, you would like twist some of the grasses and make a little top knot, if you will, in the grasses as a signifier to let people, like later foragers, know that you had already been there, right? And just like so sweet and beautifully simple as a way of communicating with other people when you aren't seeing them, but you are engaging in the same place. And I have this ongoing in the city parks that we're working, these gardens, where there's like, I see evidence of people doing things that I may like or not like in the gardens that David and I tend. And I don't necessarily have any way of communicating with them, or, just even again, back to the foraging and like, what would it be like if we had some collectively understood language that we were all using that was this kind of physical way of marking a place to let others know. And this is the loss I think we have all suffered in colonization and industrialization, in how we have lost those ways of being on land together, and that those are the systems we're needing to figure out and build back. And we, there is no going back to what was, because there's too many of us, and we're all coming from different cultural inheritances, most of which have been lost. Tracy Williams always, Sisemia from the Squamish Nation, always refers to waking sleeping knowledge, which I love as this concept and term of just recognizing, when you suddenly you do something and you're intuiting your way through it, and then it's like, oh, this is what I'm doing. Like, this is in my fingertips. I am holding this in my body. My body knew how to do this, even if my brain couldn't have articulated it. I figured it out. And there's so much sleeping knowledge for how societally we can be living on the land and with the plants and the other than human in a good way that has been given up or taken from us through industrialization and colonization. And so that's really where we're at, right? Is totally. Like trying to figure that out, trying to get that sorted.
Well, and it's also not that it was like taken, but it's taken every day.
It's taken every day.
And that's the problem, is that there's like, it's not like once we figured it out, we could just get it back. It's like, it's intentionally prevented, it's intentionally taken every day, right?
Yep.
So it's not just like, how do we get it back?
It's also the choices that we still continue to make on where we are choosing to make something for ourselves, which is going to be so much slower and less efficient, versus going for a simpler, more efficient solution, which is throwing money at a problem, however that looks, right? It's kind of like, and we've, and our ancestors were making similar choices because it was easier to do things, like efficiency has kind of driven the whole human experiment, really has been driven by efficiency. And so, yeah, we've got efficiency. We've really got that in spades now. We've figured that out. So how do we get past efficiency and learn appropriate use of slowing down where we can slow down and backsourcing where we can backsource, and use the technologies that we have in appropriate ways to support doing things in ways that are softer and kinder and gentler for ourselves and each other and the planet.
Yeah.
And it's like, because things are messed up, right? Like, it's just, yeah. And like kindness and gentleness and grace are things that we're losing at a rapid pace, and that terrifies me as much as anything.
Yeah, I think about well, first, before I want to say that, I just want to show some of the progress I've made on this. You can
look, it's beautiful.
Kind of see the there it is.
That's gorgeous.
And this is just the pattern that came with this particular design. So I didn't come up with this pattern. I have my own mapped out for the next project I'm going to do.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah, I think, people like us, what we can do is like keep these systems alive and functioning as much as possible, and then wait for those inflection points, those points where society at large, like the pandemic or something, right? Like there's some big change or something that happens where then people are seeking alternatives, where the state or the social systems that exist fail us on a massive level, to the point where people are like, oh, this isn't working, we need a different thing. And we're like, yeah, well, we've got that different thing right here. And all these other people that we're connected to are also doing the same thing.
Yeah. So and I feel like the pandemic was such an interesting, bizarre, and crazy time. But one of the things that came out of it for Earthand was recognizing how much we could actually do online together. That was massive. And so we went from being an organization that, other than the gardening that needs to happen in the winter, like the willow harvest in December or January, we really didn't do any workshops in the wintertime, because it's just like, you can't, your hands are too cold. You just can't function, right? But online, like the capacity to be having gatherings and circles where people can, from the comfort of their own home, just be in their own environment and connecting with others. Like, I have had some of the most profound and deeply moving and supportive conversations with other human beings through Zoom online in the last 2 years. It's been crazy and insane and something I never would have foreseen. And I really am struck by, and this is one of the reasons why I have huge respect for you and for everything that the Rewild Portland Society has been doing, is that it's as much about the human soft skills and communication skills and how we connect to each other as human beings, and how we push where push needs to happen in various ways, as much as that is going on as the skill building on a technical, like, hey, I can make this basket, or hey, I can blacksmith this tool. It's like, yeah, it's great to have those tools, but you also need to be able to articulate how you're feeling to others and know how to listen and support your fellow human beings, because it's not just about having these cool hand skills that show you, so you can say, look at this cool stuff I made. You need to be able to also connect with people, and because that's a key part of how we're going to move beyond in this really, really polarized world that we live in now.
Yeah, I keep thinking about well, one of the things that we've added to Echoes in Time now is the social technologies camp, which didn't exist, I don't think, when you were there last.
No, can you give me a short
Yeah.
the commercial of it.
So, for those who don't know, Echoes in Time Ancestral Skills Gathering, that is a program of Rewild Portland now, but it's actually been in existence for almost 25 years. I think next year, the year after, will be the 25th anniversary. Next year will be 25 years. But yeah, we have different technology camps around. We've got basket camp, fiber camp, blacksmithing, hide tanning. And last year we added social technologies camp. So it's basically just like a blanket for conversation, for all of the things of, the dialogue around these kinds of things, conflict resolution, languages. What are all the things that are skills that are social skills,
I love it.
And so, yeah, actually, Sheila, one of our board members who does a lot of that stuff professionally, she's sort of the one that's been holding down social technologies camp. And yeah, it's just another one of those ways of bringing.
And I love that term. Is that your term, or is that a term that's just out there?
Social technology, I don't know. I feel like that's been in the milieu of me and my friends here for a long time. I don't know if we coined it or not, but yeah, it just makes me think of, even the open space technology probably comes from some of that too. The sort of like team building world, and I don't know. Open space is the way that we run the Rewilding conference, and also in part how we run Echoes in Time a little bit. But yeah, anyway, so yeah, last year we did language games there. We did conflict resolution. We did people held conversations around neurodiversity and rewilding. It was really cool. So yeah, we'll be doing that again this year.
That's fantastic. Awesome. That's great. That's great. Yeah, and it's, like that's one of the things that I really so I haven't talked about David really, but David Goman is my partner and very much my collaborator at Means of Production Garden with holding down the work that happens there and using a lot of the materials in his own carving practice. And the tending of that garden would not be able to happen in the way it does if it wasn't for the sake that it's just a part of our lifestyle, that this is what we do, is we go to the garden together and we spend time in the garden with our, we generally go together, but then he's going and he's working in one area and I'm off doing something else in another area. And I've been told I'm not allowed to refer to it as a date at the Means of Production Garden because David got tired of there being too many what we'll call bad dates where we would arrive and we're finding encampments on top of plantings that have been destroyed or trees that have been broken because somebody's, having a really shitty day and they take it out on trees. That happens. And then, it's like what our own emotional capacity is for coping with the damage and the destruction that happens to the plants that we are tending, and just the vulnerability and the volatility of having these urban parks that are open access and used by many and abused by some, is the hard way of putting it. But it's also recognizing that there's like probably some social service that has happened in the hit that the tree has taken, has perhaps been a energy output that individual needed to purge from their system, and the tree has taken it instead of somebody else who's possibly also having a hard go of it. So yeah, just that I don't think I'm articulating that particularly well, but a lot of stuff goes down in parks, and it's a lot of it can be hard, a lot of it can be destabilizing for our own emotional equilibrium in terms of what we're coping with. Last night, for instance, I arrived in the garden to get ready for, I've got a school group that's going to be doing some work in the garden, and they're going to be like trimming the willow fence and the willow trimming around the flax bed. and and then they're going to be processing flax. So they're going to kind of see what the plants are like as kind of like 5-week-old babies versus when the flax is fully grown. And then they're going to be stripping the leaves off of the willow fence that they're trimming to do some tannin tests for cloth. And they're going to learn how to make rope with the willow bark, and and blah 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 blah.
Cool.
So anyway, I arrived to do some of the prep work to just get that bed ready for them to be in it. And somebody had come along and weeded, shall we say, a huge area of the plantain that was like beautiful long stalks that I was going to have the kids harvest those plantain stalks for some weaving. And it's all been ripped out, and a bunch of dye plants have been ripped out, and the sticks that were staking around the flax bed have been ripped out, and the hollyhock I'd grown on my balcony that I just planted last week. I went through this big mound of green waste that they left in the middle of the bed. And those weren't there. So I think they've just stolen the plants. So at least hopefully those plants continue to live. But, it's that emotional roller coaster of, you invest this time and you put this energy in. And it's like, and I've also kind of like in my head, I've got this kind of hopeful thought of like what I'm going to be doing with these 26 kids on Friday. And then you arrive at the site and it's like, oh shit, and that's just hard. That's gutting. And it's recognizing how buoyant I have to be on a regular basis to be able to take that time and time and time again. And at what point do I just, not have the buoyancy? When do I not have the capacity to rebound on that?
So this makes me think of like, how I perceive of wildness really, and the challenges of just the other forces of nature that exist in the world. But it makes me think of, the tree that keeps coming back, even though it's been chopped at, it's been paved, the roots have been paved over. Like a tree just grows, and I think about that a lot with like some of the stuff that we do, like the passion that drives us to do what we do. It's not that it's endless, but in a sense, it's like a well that, keeps coming back. And we might need to take a break here or there, but there's always some sort of thing of just like, on the one hand, it's expected that there's going to be things like that.
Absolutely.
Especially just within the population density of the city and the lack of care for people of certain demographics that need more care than others and are not provided that care. And
I definitely, like now it's been what, 15 plus years that I've been 15, 16 years that I've been working in these gardens, and I see the waves. Like it's relevant. Like when people are, when there is like the crush in housing crisis, and people that are unhoused are suffering the most, that's when the trees suffer. That's when the planting, right? Like it's a direct relative. There's no question that relationship exists. It's one thing is not in a vacuum versus another. Like it's all, we're all in this.
It's interesting too. Like in Portland, the houseless crisis is like reaching. It's never been probably as bad as it is now. I mean, it's like a national thing in general, but also Portland is like one of the big things. And there's like, there's really not a lot of movement. People are just arguing over what to do. And there's, you have people that are along like one of the former mayors of Portland came up with a plan that was basically like a concentration camp style solution, which of course nobody wanted. That was sane, except for all of the like heartless rich people or whatever who want like a quick fix. But like, all the statistics, all the things show that those don't really work.
No.
So, long-term planning, what is it? I mean, but also what it is we're facing an economic crisis globally, like collapse. Like there's just all these factors. So it's hard to understand fully how a government could respond to any of those things in any particular way that would actually help people when it's a global crises that we're facing, right? But there's nobody, there's a parks department, which is trying to take care of the green spaces here, and ODOT, which, Oregon Department of Transportation, which takes care of some of the green spaces. But essentially what they do is have the police come in, remove people, and then, try to restore some of the green space. And then it's this, more people
and
move
it's a
in
cycle, right? And then,
yeah, right, exactly.
Meanwhile, those people who have such already internal systems under chronic attack, and
right.
any semblance of order that they've been able to create for themselves is just like, picked up and thrown. And so, so that the constant living and working in a state of crisis for any of us is horrific, right? Like, that's just not tenable.
Yeah.
It was interesting. We had CERB, Canadian Emergency Response, blah, blah, blah. I can't remember what the B stood for, but anyway, it was basically, it was like one of the first times that if you were a gig worker or didn't have like regular 9-to-5 job that you would be laid off from and be able to go on unemployment insurance, that there was just this like baseline money that every Canadian was eligible for. I'm saying every Canadian. I wasn't getting it. I got like a grant to do my nettle coat on March 13th, if you can believe it, 2020. So anyway, but it was like one of the few times where suddenly people just had some time and space with their core baseline needs taken care of. And for people who had higher incomes and higher monthly expenses, it wasn't going to hit the mark for them. It wasn't going to cover enough. But for so many people who were living in a much more, bare bones way, shall we say, suddenly there was just capacity to think and to move and to support neighbors and to be present in a way that had never existed before. And it really kind of gave a lot of folks that had never given much thought of living, basic living income, kind of this realization of like, oh, wait a minute, maybe there's something here we need to revisit. So I don't know. We'll see if that ever comes about.
Is this like the universal basic income?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But that notion of where we are when we think about rewilding and we think about how do we support community and how do we support each other, it's needing to get away from this hard crunch of like paying, for instance, $2,000 in rent every month to just have a roof over your head. And then how many jobs are you having to struggle to maintain? And how many hours outside of the job do you have to think about taking care of yourself, never mind volunteering or supporting a community organization or your next door neighbor or a friend with whatever their crisis they're in? So it's like, needing to get beyond that modality so that we can actually be supportive of each other and be thinking about how we backsource and take care of ourselves and grow some of our own food. And we don't need to grow all of our own food. We don't need to make all of our own clothing, but if we know the skills that are involved in making our clothing and growing our clothing, then we're going to treat our clothing better.
Totally.
And then fast fashion,
and we can mend it when it's,
fuck right off, right? And if we are knowing what it takes to grow our food and what it takes to make our meals, then we aren't going to be having fridges full of rotting food. And we are not, because we'll have respect for the food again and respect for the people who are growing our food. And suddenly we're not going to have the food waste that we have. So it's like, we're just so disconnected now from what we need and what we consume and how we create the space in our daily lives to actually reconnect so that we can change our systems of thinking and our modes of being. That's the key piece we need to figure out.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we're holding it down.
Yeah,
we're holding it down as best we can.
Go team. Yeah. Well, and like every little bit, right? Like just pick an area that fits and that intrigues you and start from there, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I think all of the work that you're doing up there, it's definitely inspiring to us here in town, with Rewild. And I'm sure it's, inspiring to all of the other people around the world who are using that model or learning about it from you and adapting and who've read your book, all that kind of stuff. And I feel like, it's just a matter of time I think rewilding on one sense gets easier every year, that the collapse gets more, the collapse of, global societies get closer, or, move along the path, because more and more people look for alternatives. More and more people are realizing the urgency of the situation.
Yeah.
And so
suddenly
even though the
we're
situation's
relevant, Peter, we're not fringe anymore. We're relevant.
Right.
Holy
even though the
cow,
situation is getting worse, it's also getting
yeah.
easier in a different way, right? Like there's more people interested in alternative ways. And I guess that's
absolutely.
what I'm saying, I think what we're doing is, people like us are doing this work regardless of whether things change or not.
Yeah.
We want to be change makers. We want to like live our lives in a different way, right? So there's people like us, but then there's the inflection points where people en masse are in need of a different system. And I think that's when we can see like a bigger benefit of, on a larger scale, of the type of work that we do.
Yeah. And I think one of the key things that both you and I do is, there's a lot of talk about fiber sheds. We all are familiar, probably people listening to this, with the concept of a fiber shed, but what is our skill shed? What is your circle of people that you can turn to that know how to fix things and make things and mend things in your immediate environs, right? And I think the work that both you and I do, that Rewild and Earthand are really invested in, is that it's like social service work, really.
Totally.
Being of service to the community in terms of building that skill shed and recognizing, who's showing up, who's not, how do we bring in those that aren't yet feeling welcome, and what skills are missing, where are the gaps that we need to maybe try and focus some energy to build into those areas. And I think that's good work. Keep going.
You too. Are there any last bits of anything you want to share before we wrap it up?
I have no idea. It's all been kind of blur.
How about what's
seeing you this summer?
How about what's one thing that you're really excited about, that you're looking forward to?
I am looking forward to warping. My next loom is going to be a new milestone in my weaving for actually following a pattern and not just making it up on the fly, for doing a houndstooth. And it's a multi-heddle bar, so doing a twill for a houndstooth with
I don't know what any of that means, but I imagine it will look really cool.
People might get it. With nettle that's been dyed in indigo, and and then a nettle and wool print. So I'm super excited about some of the fiber and textile work that's happening right now. And I fed my nettle plants that were unwanted in an area, were made into a compost, and I used like compost tea, and I used that compost tea to feed the indigo plants that will be dyeing my nettle this fall. So there was a little moment yesterday that was this nice, the plants in a way meeting on the land.
That's really cool.
So nettle and indigo is what I'm excited about right now.
Awesome. Cool. Well, looking forward to see your finished project of that when you're done. Or just see you working on it. Yeah, I know. All these things take a long time. Yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming on the Rewilding podcast. I'm surprised that it took this long, but
it's all good. It's lovely as always to talk with you.
Yeah, you as well. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rewilding podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guest and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. And if you're new to rewilding or want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewilding 101 workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. Thanks for listening.